Imagine you are the assistant district attorney for the state of New York. You know who I'm talking about? Jack McCoy. You remember Jack McCoy from Law and Order? Now you are the assistant district attorney from Law and Order. You can hear that, can't you? And you are going into court. You are facing a very complicated case. And the opposition, the defendant, has a super strong case, but the evidence isn't super clear. And it looks like the jury isn't convinced what that tap dancing, super slick attorney who's defending innocent until proven guilty, who's defending that other person. It doesn't sound like the jury's very convinced by what they're saying. Now, you are a lawyer and you have spent a ton of time and a ton of training and tons of resources, lots of smart people learning how to handle a case and ask the right questions in the right order to lead the jury to the conclusions that you want to lead them to. You know how to ask leading questions. You know how to put the breadcrumbs in place to allow the jury to arrive at the right conclusion. And that is, that defendant is guilty, Your Honor. Something like that, right? Now, the lawyers on those TV shows, and I know that lawyers also do this in real life as well. It's not always like television, but they ask strategic questions in the right sequence, not just so that way the jury understands the facts, but so that way he can guide them to the conclusion that he wants to guide them to. And that is exactly what we're getting into in today's episode. How to ask the right questions in the right order to ensure that you lead your prospects to the sale, the conclusion you want them to get to. And we're talking today with Carole Mahoney. Now, she is the author of the book Buyers First and the founder of Unbound Growth. She also mentors Harvard Business School's entrepreneurial MBA students in sales and has been recognized as one of the top 15 sales influencers by LinkedIn in 2020. She was named Woman to Watch in Sales by Sales Hacker and celebrated as a top sales coach by Ambition. So I want to welcome you to How to Sell More, the sales podcast for non-salespeople, where each week we give a masterclass to help ambitious B2B leaders just like you face the number one challenge every business struggles with, and that is growing revenue. I'm Mark Drager. Let's get into it. So Carole, one thing I noticed in your bio is it says that you are the coach for the entrepreneurial MBA program at Harvard. Is that right?
Yes. So my official title is Entrepreneurial Sales Coach for the MBA program. We actually just started our spring semester yesterday.
Okay. So I don't have an undergrad. I never went to college or university. I look at people with MBAs and I used to be like, oh man, you have an MBA. Now I feel like it's kind of like they're just turning people out with MBAs as a bit of the industrial educational complex. What interested me was like Harvard. That's pretty cool. First. Second, why does the MBA program need a sales coach, right? Like, aren't they all going into like finance jobs?
Well, that's a good question. And what happened is that there's this little book that was written a couple of decades ago called What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School. And the thing that they don't teach you is that once you leave business school and you go out into the business world, the author was lamenting the fact that there was no sales training or even mention of sales in the business school. And sales is the lifeblood of every business. The other part of it is that the dean realized is that by learning sales skills as an MBA, no matter whether you go in to be an analyst or a researcher or a consultant at, Bain or one of those larger consulting companies, sales skills are the things that are going to actually help you be successful in those roles, which I completely agree with, because whether you're a marketer or a business owner, you're still a salesperson. You're still trying to persuade or influence someone to get resources, to take on your ideas, to understand their problems and solutions. So it's a sales skill. So I often say sales skills are life skills. And so as an MBA student going into, the world, having those kinds of skills helps you to be more successful in whatever role it is that you decide to go into.
And if you had to break down the 1, 2, 3, like really key takeaways that you're trying to instill in these students, I have to imagine that, of course, like in the top of my head, I think of MBA students tend to be younger, but often people are going back for an MBA. So these are people with experience. These are people maybe in their 30s or 40s or looking to level up and hit that next level, not just 22-year-olds.
Yeah.
But what are you focusing on, like these 1, 2, or 3 key points?
I think the first point that we're trying to get through to them is that you may have a Ferrari mind, but how smart you are isn't always necessarily the thing that's going to make you successful in a sales conversation. And I actually saw this in the first year I started doing this with my Harvard students was, they came in, it's an experiential experience. And so they have case studies. They actually have to play the role of a salesperson and a buyer. So they're actually understanding what the role might be like. And the first year, the first students that came in, the first calls that they did, it was pitch slaps. Like, here I am. I've got this product for you. It's wonderful. We're going to give you a huge discount. They never stopped to pause. They never stopped to ask a question. And when I was coaching them later on, I was giving them pushback as to why they didn't ask a single question in the conversation. Their response was, well, won't they think I don't know what I'm talking about if I ask too many questions? Don't people get annoyed by asking too many questions? And that was a huge light bulb moment for me because they were taking their perception of what other people looked at them as, and that was causing their behaviors. So that was the first thing I try to get my students to understand, and that they teach really well in the course now, is that it doesn't matter what you know or how much you think you know. It is really all about understanding where your buyer or your customer thinks that they know, because it has to be all about them.
Before we move on to the next point, I just want to pause on that. I did notice in my own agency that once we got so good at productizing a service and selecting our targets carefully, pre-qualifying them and moving them in the process, it became almost like through repetition and muscle memory.
Yeah.
We were able to skip 4 or 5 steps and get clients right to the solution, but we were robbing the prospects of the opportunity of self-discovery. And even though I wanted to save time, even though I was bored and the team was bored by asking these questions, I realized that there was this performative nature of asking the right questions to allow the prospect to draw the right conclusions rather than us just jump straight to the end.
Yeah, exactly.
I made a lot of mistakes doing it.
Well, and the other thing is that when you make assumptions, the old saying, you make a you-know-what out of you and me. But that even though maybe you feel like you're asking these same kinds of questions over and over again, the honest answers that you get back are not always the same. And that's the second thing that we really try to drill into the students is, poor salespeople don't ask any questions. Okay, salespeople, they ask some questions, but they're typically closed-ended questions, yes or no answers. Good salespeople ask open-ended questions. Great salespeople ask open-ended sequential questions, like they're asking an open-ended question, asking another one to dig deeper and deeper and uncover more things. But an excellent salesperson is the one who can ask those open-ended sequential questions and then customize their value proposition in their demo based on the answers that they're getting so that they can tie problems and solutions together, which is one of the things that I see so many salespeople and marketers struggle with is how do we tie what our buyers are thinking and feeling to the solutions that we offer and lowering the risk in their mind to be able to do so. And that's what top salespeople, elite salespeople are able to do. And then I think the final thing that we're trying to teach our Harvard students.
I'm going to keep jumping in because I want to just ask a question on that second point. So I learned a few years ago, completely outside of sales, more on personal development side, the idea of like 5 levels or 7 levels deep. Yep. The idea of in a trusted space where you would ask someone a question and they would give you the first answer and you'd say, that's interesting. And you repeat back their terminology and then ask a follow-up question, repeat back the terminology, ask a follow-up, and continue pushing to the point where usually around 4 or 5 levels into it, people are running out of words. They're running out of rote responses. They are forced to rethink it a different way because you will not just gloss over this uncomfortable moment. And when we started incorporating that into our sales process, we realized that was the type of thing that was required. Am I correct in connecting those dots, or is there a framework that you've used to be able to address this idea of asking the right questions, asking open-ended questions, asking the right sequential questions, and then making it customized experience for the person you're across the table from?
Yes, almost exactly. The one thing I would add into that framework that you just shared is so asking the first open-ended question. And maybe you go 2 or 3 layers deep in that first sort of thread of questions. Now you've got maybe a pile of information that you then summarize where you're repeating back to them what you've heard. But there's another piece to this that a lot of people miss, which is one of the things that buyers today value is tell me something I don't know or something that I haven't fully considered or something Google can't answer for me. And as the salesperson, when you're hearing what they're saying, you're summarizing that, offering some type of an insight to them to get them thinking a little bit differently about how they might be perceiving their problem or the solutions that they have. And then following that up with an open-ended diagnostic question that into that. I'm not really sure how we're going to handle this particular obstacle that you just shared with me. What's your advice? What do you think that we should do? That is absolute gold right there. And so being able to offer insights to our customers or our buyers in a way that helps them to think differently, that's what buyers today value. Also, the other side of this is by asking these open-ended questions, essentially what we're doing is collaborating with our buyers to come up with that solution. And it's that collaborative nature of things that people value even more. Like I would even argue when you were talking about how you had these questions that you went through all of the time, that one of the things that might be missing is that when we don't ask enough of those deeper questions and offering those insights, what's happening is that the value in our buyer's mind is not as high as it could be. But when buyers feel that their input is being taken into consideration, that they're actually helping to form a solution with you, they place more value on that because they've got skin in the game. They've contributed their input into it. And in Harvard Business Review, they called this the IKEA effect. In other words, the more we put effort into something, the more value we place on it. And that's what happens in these collaborative, open-ended kind of questioning techniques and conversations.
That is so interesting. When I'm working with my clients, one of the first things I look at is not necessarily their speed to sale, because often you're looking to increase velocity, but in fact, whether they are trying to rush the sale. And I'm a huge proponent now. I come from a certain background. If you're selling consumer products or goods, and there's a lot of situations that this doesn't apply to, but when you're selling more complex professional services or B2B or enterprise level solutions, I like to just make the process as long as we possibly can, because the more high level decision makers I have, and so usually I'm trying to just scope, and then I'm trying to earn the right to bring the right people in, and then re-educate, and then build a framework. And this takes a ton of resources on our side and a ton of time. Mm-hmm. But if they keep giving me time and resources, and they're transparent and they're open and they're honest, by the time we get to the proposal, there is nothing new there. Like there's no close. It's literally like we've already done all the work we need to do. Exactly. And often we're paid for this work, even as a small initial kickoff. But I'm not trying to close anyone on anything. It's just literally, let's get the paperwork signed so we can move on to the next step, because it's become a natural progression. I know this doesn't work in RFPs or other competitive situations, but is that the type of thing that you see our world moving to?
That is the type of thing that I see a lot of B2B sales moving into. Like you said, too, RFPs are not necessarily the type of sale that's going to work in, but everyone wants to feel that their case is special, that their case is unique, and that they've built this solution out with you. And so if you've done your job well as a salesperson, you don't need to say, all right, it's now the time for us to close the business. It's a natural occurrence because we've already covered it. We've dotted the I's, we've crossed the T's. And then it just comes down to 3 questions. Do you believe that we understand everything about what's going on? Do you believe we have the solution to help? And do you want our help? And if the answer to any of those 3 things is a maybe or a no, then you've missed something and you need to go back and cover that piece of things, which that's not necessarily something we teach our Harvard students. But you asked what was the top 3 things. The third thing, I'm having a hard time choosing because there's 2.
Because you love them so much?
I do. Yeah, there are so many things that we teach them that are so essential. But I would say probably, and this is something I see in my own clients that I'm coaching and training, is that they will approach different levels of the organization in the same way. Like what the CEO cares about is not what the manager cares about, which is not what the end user cares about. And so your questions need to be targeted to the role of the person and the concerns that they have. The other thing that, so that we call that the complex decision-making process. And so that's the other thing that we're trying to teach them is you don't sell the same way to everyone. Each person has not only their own personality, but their own responsibilities and things that they're measured by. That's how you need to then target your questions in a way that speaks directly to the things that individual cares about. No assumptions.
That's actually a point I've taken for granted, I think, for far too long. I started my company in 2006. It was a very hard lesson. It probably took me about 2.5 years to realize how important what you just said was. But once it clicked in my mind, the idea of target segmentation, and trying to figure out if you're going to segment based on need or based on demo or based on challenge or psychographic or what have you, just became a natural part of the way that we all thought. And I didn't realize that people still struggle with that. If I'm going to speak to a C-suite person, then obviously I might be more operationals or finance focused or worry more about shareholder returns if it's a publicly traded company or what have you. If I'm speaking to someone who's more of a manager level, well, they're more focused on their department, their silo, making their quarter, managing up, making sure it can be implemented, making sure they don't look bad if they're making investments and it fails.
Right.
And I suppose perhaps I do this naturally, but this is something that is a learned skill. And are people not focusing on this or talking about it?
Well, it's not that they're not focusing on it, they're not talking about it, but they're also not being taught it. Whether it's in their sales training within their companies, there are some sales books that do address these things. But I think what happens is that we've trained our salespeople and our marketing collateral to focus on features and benefits, and we somehow assume that these features and benefits apply across the board. But what we need to do as salespeople and as marketers is to be able to understand not just what is it that they're measured by, but what's the psychology behind this. So you mentioned, the CEO cares about these things. They also care about the brand, the customer experience, their legacy. Whereas managers care about, yes, how do I look good to my bosses? Do I have a trusted strategic partner here? Whereas the end user cares about, am I going to be able to do my job well so that I can get the next promotion? And so it's understanding both what their role and measurements are, but then also psychologically in that role, what are they trying to do in that? And what's important to them internally? That I think is a part that we overlook a lot of times. Like we make the assumption that the CEO is going to be the decision maker, but often that CEO has to report to a board or shareholders or stakeholders in some other way. And so they're not always the final decision maker. And so understanding how they're measured and what they care about is going to be crucial in you being able to get them on board.
So what I've always done is found it's best just to ask them. I can think back to a nonprofit, a charity we were working with, one of these types of charities that helps grant wishes to children in need. And they were struggling with moving from a philanthropic-based model to a corporate sponsorship-based model where corporate giving was really being moved over to marketing as opposed to just large endowments. And they had some clear ideas on who they'd target. And I didn't think it would really align. So through my network, I found a few people who had connections to some of the largest foundations in Canada at some of the largest banks. I reached out. I said, I have a client who has these needs. Can I have 10 minutes of your time? And then I just asked them. And they literally gave me the roadmap. They said, here's our criteria. Here's what's in. Here's what's out. Here's what they would need to do. Here's how they'd have to go about it. And I've always found that 2 weeks ago, I was in Phoenix on a hike with someone. I don't really understand how accountants make the decisions that they make. This person runs an accounting firm, a fractional CFO firm.
Yep.
And so the whole hike, I was just picking their brain, asking them, what do your clients want? What do they value? Would they do this? What are people focused on? I have never, if you ask a question to people will just give you the answer. So is that the solution?
Yeah.
Or what's the best way for people to go about this?
There's this psychological, neurological reason why that happens. First of all, we love talking about what we think. We love sharing our opinions. And when
you're talking to a podcast here. I got it.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so what happens is that when we get asked our opinions of things, now this applies to what you just described as trying to learn more about particular buying segment. It also applies when you're asking those open-ended questions of your buyers in a collaborative way. What's happening is that as they're sharing their thoughts and their ideas and what they think, they're getting these huge dopamine hits in their brain. Dopamine is that thing that makes us feel good, but it also comes from the part of our brain where we form relationships and trust. And so the more we talk about ourselves, the more people listen to us, we start to feel some affinity to that person who's asking these questions and giving us this opportunity to spout off what we think. And so the thing that's surprising to me is how much people don't realize how much you love talking about yourself. Well, so do they. So if you can just learn to shut up, you'll be able to win more deals and gain more friends if you could just learn to be quiet.
How are your dopamine levels doing right now? You feeling good?
They're totally off the charts right now.
Exactly. For our listeners, you can't see. But something happens when I'm interviewing people where I get so into it and I smile so much and love it so much that I get this vein on the top of my head that does not come up any other time other than when I'm podcasting.
Exactly.
I want to shift gears slightly because you are the author of the book Buyer First, Grow Your Business with Collaborative Selling. Yes. And I've heard you in a few other podcasts and with some of my research talk about the 6 mindsets. Now, not necessarily that this is lifting straight from your book, but I thought this was really powerful. Can you share the 6 mindsets in terms of salespeople and the traps we could fall into if we get stuck with them?
Yeah. So these 6 mindsets actually come from Objective Management Group, which I'm a partner with. And they have data from over 2.3 million sales professionals gathered over the last 30 years across the globe, across industries, across cultures. And the thing that was interesting is that as I started diving into this data, I started to realize, one, that we all talk about skills in sales. We all talk about techniques that we need to do, but we don't talk about the mindsets that either help or hinder us in executing on those things. And so what Objective Management Group has done, and what I do with my clients, is they've narrowed it down to 6 specific mindsets that impact us in our sales techniques. One of those, and the most common one that most salespeople have, 73% of salespeople worldwide struggle with their own buying process. In other words, I call it the how you buy is how you sell dynamic. How you make your purchase decisions is how you assume your buyers will make their purchase decisions. So if you're someone who has to research before you buy some to the nth degree, now just FYI, I'm not saying go out and buy a house and a car without doing your research and checking things out.
I've done that.
I used to know someone who had an Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs to buy a pair of sneakers. Like a $200 pair of sneakers, and it took them like 6 months to decide, and they were comparing all of these features and benefits. They were delaying their decision. They had to ask everybody else around them what it was. This was a salesperson who also had really long sales cycles, who also got a lot of delays, and people who were trying to think it over, because in their mind, they thought, well, yeah, this is a huge investment. I would need to think it over. I totally understand that you need to do the same thing. That's the most common mindset that gets in the way. When you have a supportive mindset where you have a buy cycle where you make decisions in a certain period of time with certain criteria, then you're the kind of person who's going to be able to push back at your buyers when they say, you know what, I need to go think this over. And ask those questions of, okay, what is it in your mind that's still unanswered for you? Or what hesitation or risk in your mind is causing you to back away from this? Without that supportive mindset, you won't do that. The next most common one.
So this not only impacts, like, great example in terms of the amount of research, the amount of data, the amount, like, it's almost like they need to make, they've removed the idea of that anyone makes emotional decisions.
Right.
But I tend to be, I don't like the word cheap. Because I do invest in anything that I value, but I place so much importance on a risk benefit or investment relative to potential returns or value that I assume a lot of people shop that way. I'm not a luxury person. I'm super, super practical. Right. And it took me a very long time to realize that just because some people think differently doesn't mean it's wrong.
Right.
And so there's price, there's time, there's information. Are there a few of the other traps that we fall into in this idea of projecting our own buying journey on prospects?
Yeah. How much money is a lot of money? I grew up in a blue collar family. Growing up, $1,000 was a huge amount of money for me and my family. And so when I started getting into the business world and started to have to deal with solutions that cost tens of thousands of dollars, I had a hard time with that. I had to get over my own tolerance of how much money was a lot of money and figure out how was I projecting this idea of a lot of money onto other people. When that happens, we tend to discount more, right? You've probably heard it in sales conversations where they say the price and then they immediately say, but we can discount that by 20%, because in their mind, it's a lot of money and they're projecting that onto their buyers. Whereas their buyers are like, that's nothing. That's less than 2% of my budget per year. But to us, it's a ton of money. So we have to reconcile that how we think about money isn't how everybody thinks about money. And what's a lot to us isn't necessarily a lot to someone else. So the next one that's the most common one, and it is the most human one that's out there, is the need for approval. We all need to seek validation. As children, we look to our parents when we did something new to see if we were doing it right. And it's something like, even in our hardwired DNA, if you weren't part of the tribe back in the caveman days, you were dead because you couldn't live, you couldn't survive. So it's hardwired into our brains to seek approval from others. But it gets in our way when we get into sales situations, when we have to try to get to decision makers, or when we have to ask those tough questions that might make people uncomfortable. Or even like the Harvard student that I described, who thought asking too many questions would make people think that he wasn't smart enough. So our need to be seen a certain way will get in our way of asking tough questions and challenging people. But when it supports us, then we can ask those tough questions that get buyers to think about, maybe I'm not thinking about this the right way, or asking about, how is your boss going to make this decision? How do we get them involved in this conversation, and even be willing to go to that boss directly? I don't want to upset my champion. Then they won't like me. If they don't like me, then they're not going to buy from me. Not true. People buy from people they like, yes, and respect. And nobody respects someone that says yes to everything that they say, which is another sign of a need for approval, where you just agree with what everyone says because you don't want to upset them. So that's the second one. The next one that's most common is what we call emotional involvement or emotional management in the sale. When you get excited, when you start hearing the buying signals, or you start getting excited that someone has said that they're going to move to the next stage, or when you get freaked out, when you hear objections, you start scrambling in your mind, the reptilian brain starts to kick in, and all of a sudden you've stopped listening because you're too busy listening to the voices in your head that are telling you this isn't going to work or this is going to be great. And when you stop listening to your buyers, you're missing the clues and the cues of what they're saying or not saying. And so then it's hard for you to think of what's that next question that I need to ask? What's that next open-ended that I need to ask? I've seen it where it's almost like the salesperson isn't even there. They're not even listening. They're just going through their checklist of questions, going to the next stage of their process without actually being in the present moment with their buyers. And the good news is that you can change all of these things. The fourth one that is often happening is the fear of rejection. This is where, it's pretty self-explanatory. We don't make the cold calls because we don't want to face the rejection. We don't ask the tough questions because they might say no, or we hold on to the deal in our pipeline that isn't going anywhere because we don't want to face the rejection of that it didn't actually happen.
Oh, I do that. Potential is so much better than hearing no.
Yeah, I will offer this to you. If you find that you're someone who who holds onto a deal and it just sits there, think of it like a river. If a river is moving, it's healthy, it's flowing. But if it's not moving, it gets stagnant. It gets like bacteria built up in it. And that's what's happening in your pipeline, in your sales pipeline, is that the longer things sit there, they start to ferment. And you don't want that. Unless you're making alcohol. And so constant movement, kicking things out of your pipeline does a couple of things. One is that it makes you then have to focus on how am I going to replace this particular opportunity, which is another reason why we keep them in there and that fear of rejection comes up. But then the other part of it is that when we're looking at our pipeline in a way that we want to have that movement, we're very careful about the questions that we ask. We're very careful about how we qualify these things. And if we're not able to move it and kick it out, then we can have a fresh perspective on that. It's almost like keeping it there is like a security blanket for us. And then the last one is really about the supportive beliefs that actually influence all of the other 5 mindsets. And the beliefs are the things that cause these systems and mindsets to happen. So, for example, I mentioned the belief that people need to like me in order to buy from me. That's not a very supportive belief because then it causes us that need for approval. Or, $1,000 is a lot of money. That contributes to our supportive buy cycle. Or, rejection is too tough for me. I can't get over that. The beliefs that we have feed into the mindsets that we have. But the good news is we can change our beliefs. We can change our minds. We do it all the time. It's just being very intentional about what beliefs and what mindsets are preventing me from doing the things that I know that I can do and should do, but I don't necessarily do them in the moment with my buyer when I need to. I chicken out, I forget, or I just think, I don't need to do that.
Hey there, it's Mark again. If you really loved the talk that I just had with Carole, I want to point out that my strategic branding agency, Sales Loop, we help B2B business owners and their teams develop a sound strategy and action plan to be able to meet sales, revenue, messaging, differentiation, branding challenges head on. Ultimately, we're here to help you sell more. So if you're interested in attracting and closing more high-value clients, or staying top of mind with your current clients, which is always a struggle, or if you're really looking to become the credible market leader in your industry, the name that everyone points to say they are doing it the best way you possibly can, then you'll want to connect with me over on LinkedIn. Send me a message and we will set up a call. Once again, that was Carole Mahoney. And with that said, let's jump into the 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. Number 1, active listening is crucial. It's crucial for identifying what the underlying challenges or objectives or goals or perceived risks or fears or desires or hope for outcomes or whatever it is. Everything that is going on in the client, in the prospect's world, you need to be able to pull out of them with the right questions, for sure, but you have to listen very, very carefully to be able to render out in real time what the next question should be. Number 2, from my perspective, in B2B, the sales process should be collaborative. Now, there are little tips and tricks you can do to make it feel more collaborative, You can do proposal drafts. You can ensure that people understand that this is a first draft of a proposal, that this is a work in progress, that this is not completed. You can send it out for additional thoughts. I have always found with complex B2B sales, taking a consultative approach where you collaborate with your prospect to go back and forth and ensure that you're right-sizing the solution for their timelines, for their budgets, for their needs. So that is the best way to get them to buy into it. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of time. It's a lot of commitment up front. It's very, very painful when those deals don't go through after the time you've put into it. But in my experience, collaborating with your client really ensures that whatever you are offering feels and is tailor-made to address their unique needs, and that enhances the perceived value of your service or your productized service. And of course, my third takeaway is you should never feel foolish for asking questions. I've worked with clients where they say an acronym or they say something and I think, my goodness, I have no idea what they're talking about. And then sometimes I question whether I should hide that. Should I know this? Should I know this acronym? But I have found in my career that when I interrupt them and say, I'm so sorry, can you just confirm what you mean by that? Or why is that? Or can you unpack that a little bit and explain a little bit more about what this is and why that would be? I get so much more clarity. I get so much more insight. And when I got over the fear of looking stupid, when I got over the fear of asking questions, it just allowed for a much more engaging conversation. And not only that, I came away with way more knowledge. So I didn't feel like when I was off solutioning or coming up with strategy or working on my own, I didn't feel like there were so many question marks. I felt like I had more clarity. I could understand in greater detail what we were working towards, and it made every step of the process, the scoping process, so much simpler later. So you should never be afraid to ask a stupid question. So there you have it. Those were my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. But I'm curious, what were yours? Did anything challenge your perspective? Let's dive deeper into this over on LinkedIn, where I share even more insights and I like to spark discussions over there. I'm Mark Drager. You can find my contact details in the episode show notes. Now, while you're over on LinkedIn, be sure to connect with Carole Mahoney for more relatable and data-driven insights. You can also get a copy of her book, Buyers First, where all books are sold. And you can learn more about her work over at carolemahoney.com. Now, one last thing. If you made it this far into the show, you really should subscribe. And here's why. Obviously, you're an ambitious B2B leader. Obviously, you're hungry for more actionable strategies. Obviously, you want to grow your business. You want to boost sales. Or maybe you're just a professional podcast listener who gets paid to listen to every episode ever made. I don't think that's a real job. But anyway, either way, I am Mark Drager, and I will catch you in the next episode.